program. The forum will begin shortly. Thank you.
Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. I'm Maggie Williams, Director of the Institute of Politics at Harvard University. Tonight's forum focuses on Moneyball for Government, a project which encourages governments to increase their use of evidence and data when investing taxpayer dollars. I'd like to thank tonight's forum co-host, the Taubman Center for State and Local Government, the Harvard Business School Social Enterprise Initiative, the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston, and the Ash Center for Democratic Governance. I would also like to welcome to the forum the Ash Center's project on Municipal Innovation Advisory Group. The advisory group is composed of representatives from some of America's largest cities, and we're so proud to have you with us tonight. Our moderator tonight is Nina Easton. She is the senior editor and columnist for Fortune magazine. She covers politics and economics. Easton is a sought-after commentator and a panelist and has appeared on Fox News Sunday and other political programs. And something she's doing, which I think many of you will be interested in, is the Smart Woman, Smart Power iTunes podcast series. It's original programming, which is sponsored by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's a weekly program, and I hope all of you have an opportunity to hear it. She is an author. Her book, Gang of Five Leaders at the Center of the Conservative Ascendancy, has been described as one of the best narrative accounts of the modern conservative movement. Nina Easton was a 2012 Goldsmith Fellow at the Shorenstein Center, and most importantly, she is a former fellow of the Institute of Politics. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you, Nina.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you for that introduction. So we are thrilled tonight to have two best-selling authors straight hot off the press, Moneyball for Government. I should also plug right now, you can download the whole copy, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I don't need to introduce the two gentlemen next to me, but I will anyways. Jim Nussle was, of course, a former member of Congress from Iowa, OMB director, another OMB, and you're with the National Credit Union Association now, correct, running that. Peter Orszag was a very high-profile OMB director at CBO, knows his numbers, and is now with Citigroup. Of course, Peter's a Democrat and worked under Obama, and Jim's a Republican. What you're going to hear tonight, aside from a lot of numbers and analysis and so forth, is a lot of bipartisanship. And having just come up from Washington, where I was just telling Maggie I co-wrote a book on the Reagan administration. I'm embarrassed to say that's just about how long I've been there, except for that glorious year here. And you know, as you know, the just bitter partisanship continues there. So what's really cool about this book is not only these two gentlemen joined together, but you'll see really huge names from both parties coming together on a really important cause. So you guys, you think that the sort of staid budget process in Washington actually has something to do with the Oakland A's circa 2002. Peter?
Well, yeah. The point of this book is that we can do a lot better in bringing analysis and analytics to bear on how we make decisions. And that was the basic, that's sort of where the analogy ends. But that was the key to success for the Oakland A's. It is stunning. Only 37% of federal managers have had their programs that they oversee, any program I should say, any program they oversee evaluated within the previous 5 years. Just think about that. That means 2/3 of federal managers haven't had their programs evaluated at all, or at least they're not aware of it, over the previous 5 years.
It's amazing.
We went through non-defense discretionary spending, which is the part of the budget that's set each year by the Congress outside of the Defense Department. It's outside of Medicare, Medicaid, and the entitlement programs, and tried to identify what share of the spending actually had any evidence backing it whatsoever. And our initial estimate was under 1%. We've updated those numbers, and now I'm going to say about 1%. But that means 99 cents on the dollar of non-defense discretionary spending is just kind of on autopilot. We just do it because we've been doing it, and we've got no clue whether it's working or not.
That's just amazing, and I think it's amazing for folks in this room to hear, because if you're involved with nonprofits, that sector, certainly results evaluation data has become a central part of that. And Jim, Moneyball, talk about why Moneyball and follow up on Peter's remarks.
Well, and Peter's right. I mean, the analogy is an interesting one. The movie that was very popular, I actually watched it recently again, because it's a great movie. It's a fun movie.
Are you guys baseball fans, by the way?
I am, yeah.
I grew up in Lexington, and the Boston Red Sox broke my heart so frequently that I know.
But Red Sox and
I know,
Cubs
they're back.
fans. So
They're back.
I mean,
Oh,
I'm
wow.
a Chicago Cubs fan,
Okay.
so we're still waiting. You at
Yeah.
least got one.
was
But
too
the
late.
analogy, yeah, it could be. The analogy is, it kind of ends with, of course, we're not in a dictatorship. You don't have one manager that runs everything, and you don't have one owner that can basically make all the decisions. And so you can't control all the levers. But the point that Peter was just making is that even if you did a little bit more than 1%, you'd be on a better road. But I do think there are a couple of things that came out of the movie that also bear repeating here too, that are kind of just principle level ideas, and that is that if money is not a constraint, you, generally speaking, don't have to be very creative, right? I mean, the more money you have, the more that money is not an object, the more you don't have to think about creative ways, you just keep doing it. And I think sometimes there are some that look at Washington and feel like the constraints on the resources are not as, we print money, basically.
Right.
So that's the one.
We print taxpayer dollars.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's that one side, and we can borrow unlimited amounts to add to that. I think the second part is that, the more you can introduce information to the gut level decisions, Peter mentioned it from the policy manager standpoint. From the political standpoint, I was a congressman for 16 years, and I can tell you that if 1% was done, 0% was accomplished from the political side based on evidence. It was all based on typically special interests, gut level politics, your base, trying to show off for your folks back in your home districts, et cetera, et cetera. Politics is what really drives that, not really evidence and data. So introducing more information, more data, more evidence into this process would inform it in a much more positive way. And interestingly enough, every time I have seen that happen, even to policymakers, even to political folks, it does tend to help them turn a little bit on the direction that policy heads.
So that's a huge nut, and I want to get back to that in a minute, but I want to kind of maybe talk about some of the horror stories. I have my favorite, which is job training programs, which I wrote about during the recession. We were spending $18 billion of federal money on job training programs, which the GAO said weren't working. We're in a recession.
And what are there, like 40,
And there were
47
there's like
of them?
40 of them across,
Separate
across
ones
9
that are all
agencies.
trying to-
I mean,
yeah,
it's,
right.
and some of them you could, you were actually they were like babysitting systems for adults. It was just pretty shocking.
Yeah, but you say it that way, but so from a politician standpoint, okay, so let's say I go out and I want to cut one of them.
Yeah.
What are they going to say about me, right?
You're
I
back.
must not care about people who are looking for work. I must not care about retraining. I must not care about the lower income. I don't care because I've gone in and I've challenged it or I've wanted to cut it. And I think heretofore, because that challenge came without a lot of good basic data behind it, it looked that way. So the more you can also apply information to that and evidence, I think the more it will inform the debate and will help those that want to try and push for changes, push for reforms.
Peter, what are some other examples?
Well,
Yeah.
actually, the worst examples are where, you're talking about examples where it just doesn't work. The worst examples are where it's completely counterproductive. So, for example, there's a program called Scared Straight, which some of you may be familiar with, where the thought process is if you expose young people to criminals, they will get scared straight and stay out of trouble.
Who came up with that idea?
I don't know where their origins were, but
It wasn't me.
but the results show that, unfortunately, if anything, people exposed to that type of information seem to adopt criminal behavior more frequently, not less frequently, perhaps because people look at that and say, actually, that seems kind of cool, or what have you. I don't know why, but it's completely counterproductive. So the worst situations are where you're spending money, and it's not even just a waste, it is directly counterproductive. The bulk of the problem, though, is where it's just ineffective. And let me make one other point, because I think Jim's exactly right, that when you're in a world of abundance, you can afford to not really worry too much about whether things are working. Both parties have agreed to caps on both defense and non-defense discretionary spending that I think are going to be extraordinarily hard to abide by over time, with non-defense discretionary spending next year being lower than it's been in the historical record as a share of the economy since 1962. And by 2022, 2023, we're going to be significantly below that. In that environment, you can't just indiscriminately cut things. There's a great example involving a program called Youth Opportunity Grants. Okay, so this was a program that was designed to try to help young people get on a decent career ladder, provide assistance to enter the labor market and what have you before a job training situation. And an evaluation suggested that it worked very well. It increased college graduation rates and increased earnings and what have you. Here's the problem. The evaluation occurred several years after the program had been eliminated. So if you want a great example of why indiscriminate cutting is a very bad idea as the fiscal constraints become tighter and tighter and tighter, there you go. We can't afford to be propping up programs that don't have evidence and indiscriminately cutting those that, after the fact, turn out to have been great.
Well, both of you, what was your experience at OMB? Did you notice this? Did you try to apply any kind of evaluation to it?
Yeah, so I mean, an example, I'll give you one example, which actually now has been eliminated, but it took multiple years of effort from the Bush administration and then into the Obama administration, and it involves early literacy programs, a program called Even Start that is very well intentioned. It's supposed to help boost literacy among disadvantaged youth. The problem is, again, the evidence suggests it didn't work. The design of the program was not consistent with the lofty goals, and that's often the problem that we get in. Jim said, how can you be against job training? How can you be against literacy for low-income kids? I mean, come on. Of course we're in favor of that. But if you're spending money and it's not working, that means there's some other intervention that might work that you're not investing in, and that therein lies part of the problem. In any case, after repeated attempts to curtail the funding, we finally have succeeded in the 2011 legislation to eliminate funding for that program. Again, not because anyone objected to the objective, very contrary, just to the results, which weren't there. But it is hard slog because, first of all, it's hard to go against something that seems so positive. And secondly, the people who are providing those services don't really want to hear that it might not be working that well. And it's rare that someone who is on the ground delivering services is as interested as I think one would hope they would be in actually evaluating whether it's creating the benefit. There are counterexamples.
Well, and they have the year on Capitol Hill, and you can imagine it's a ready-made press conference to go out and fight for, Even Start and literacy programs for children. I mean, it's a ready-made press conference. So, of course, the demagoguery just flies, not based on evidence, but based on emotion. And emotion is driving a lot of the decisions at this point as a result of there not being those kinds of data-driven decisions, and which is similar to my favorite part in the movie, which is really what kind of put it in context for me, is when all the coaches, all the old coaches are sitting around the table, if you've seen the movie, and they're making judgments about how good the players are, and they're making them all based on things that when you hear them say it, as scouts or as coaches, you would think, really, that's how you're making that decision? You know, how their fastball's coming in, or, you know, if they can handle a ground ball, or if they can bunt safely, or whatever it is. And it had nothing to do with statistics or on-base percentages. And again, it was based on emotion. And I think moving away from the emotion of it helps inform the policymaking process.
So let me, just based on taking off on that emotion comment, this isn't quite a what works question, but still it's right in that alley, which is you've got these programs that are designed to help people, but these programs also can provide a disincentive to, for example, work. And I think of disability as the prime example. Critics of the growth explosion in disability payments, and there have been studies actually out of MIT, right down the street, that show that it does create a disincentive to work, and that people are effectively ghettoized. They might have a disability that isn't it's not a lifelong disability. They could eventually go in the workforce, where in fact your income would start to go up as opposed to just being on a disability check every month.
Right.
So does any of the thinking about this apply to that question?
Well, let me tackle that. I mean, so what Nina's talking about is there's a rule called the substantial gainful activity rule under disability insurance, which basically says if you're able to work, you can't get disability insurance. So if you go on disability insurance and then you have some job opportunity, you're effectively giving up your disability insurance, and the marginal tax rate on that work is, you know, at 100% or more.
And we should also add, I think that the disability the view of it's been expanded to include things like, you know, emotional issues, mood disorders, and pain disorders, and so forth.
And what's happened over time is that it's, you know, think back to turn of the 20th century. A disability was like, you know, you lost your arm, or it was observable. Right. The majority of cases today are either psychological or things like back pain that are legitimate in some cases, but they're really hard for someone externally to evaluate. And the other thing is it's not sort of an on-off switch. There are degrees. You know, my back really hurts. It's uncomfortable to walk. The labor market has deteriorated, and so all of a sudden it's not really worth the effort, and I've run out of unemployment insurance. I'm going on disability insurance. And one of the biggest risks from this big rise in disability insurance over the past 5 years is that, you know, if you have a 50-year-old who went on disability insurance, the exit rate is under 1%. They're on disability for the rest of their lives. And by the way, this is also why the analysis of a lot of programs are more complicated than people say. So one of the debates involving unemployment insurance was that unemployment insurance gives you an incentive.
But it actually kept the unemployment rate up.
Right.
And there are studies that concluded that.
But, here's the big but. If you shut off unemployment insurance and instead people go on disability insurance, then you wind up with a much worse incentive effect, because at least under unemployment insurance, one of the conditions is you have to be actively seeking work, whereas under disability insurance, you have to be actively not seeking work.
Right.
So but that raises another piece of this, which is often these programs have very complicated interactions with other federal programs, and it does, I mean, just in fairness, we can be doing a lot better, but it's also the case that often evaluating, you know, doing the evaluation is complicated, in part because of all these kind of interlocked different programs that are present.
And Jim, what about the question? I mean, you know, programs designed to help people, but because of the incentives or motivations they might create, have the unintended consequence of perhaps not being the best answer to their issues.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, remember how the program was started in the first place. It was started emotionally and politically. And so it wasn't the design at the front end, so it was wired wrong from the beginning, or the incentives were based on certainly all good intentions, not to suggest that they weren't, but if you start with a bad construction or a bad design or a bad wiring, it's going to be pretty difficult to change that along the way. Also, as Peter said, and this is true in a lot of those types of programs that are really meant to help, because of the other, you know, impacts that not only other programs have, but changes in technology, depending on where you live in the country. Your access to healthcare, your access to rapid transit. I mean, there are all sorts of other impacts that will affect the effectiveness of that particular program and whether it's working.
I was just going to say, and there's one other complication here, which involves sort of at what point you're pulling the trigger or you're evaluating things. A great example is early education, Head Start-like programs. So the early evidence was very encouraging that children that are put into high-quality preschool programs benefit. And then we entered an era in which there was sort of a letdown because of the fade-out effects that basically the evidence suggested that as those kids who were helped in preschool went through regular school, the effects faded. And so if you had stopped the world at that point, you would have said, not clear this is worth it because the effects are dissipated. Roll forward a few more years, and there's gathering evidence that for whatever reason, if you look even later in life, so as those former preschool children enter the workforce and what have you, there are all sorts of benefits in terms of lower teenage pregnancies, increased employment, and what have you, even though you went through this kind of intermediate period in which it kind of looked not so good. So one of the other things that we do have to be at least cognizant of is if you've got a very targeted program that is supposed to help someone get a job, for example, and it's not doing that, that's probably a problem. If you've got something especially towards the earlier parts of life where there might be dynamic effects that happen over long periods of time, there's at least a caution that we need to kind of make sure we're doing a full analysis and not a partial one.
And so the conclusion now is that Head Start does work, even though a couple years ago they were saying it faded out.
Yes, but and actually Head Start, look, I also don't want to get us all too depressed. I mean, Head Start's a great example where I think there's a lot of progress. One of the things that the Obama administration succeeded in doing is saying, okay, it does seem like there's some benefits to early education. However, there's also a wide variation. All of the, not all, but most of the really high quality studies were done with really good high intensity early education programs, and not all Head Start programs were like that. So what the Obama administration started doing is basically taking the bottom 10% of Head Start programs or centers and culling them and trying to upgrade the whole program over time, which I think is so you can't just say Head Start works because there's tons of different Head Start centers and types and what have you. You have to be focused even within that on improving performance. And
but that was controversial when you guys did. I mean, that was tough. You talk about, if the Bush administration had done that, forget it. But I mean, the fact that you guys took that on was a huge lift. But I think a lift only you guys could have done. Right?
Nixon in China.
Right, Nixon in China. I think that's right.
And so what do you guys, you outlined some good solutions or at least steps forward in the book. Talk about that. What should be done at agencies?
Well, okay. So first of all, this is not a cookbook. All right, there's nothing in here that you could say you have to follow this or you have to do this or this is the only way to do it. It's more like maybe a travel book. There are many ways. This is a journey. You're not going to get to perfect. The journey will never end. There's no destination that is, you can say, okay, I've been there, now I can go back. And there are things along the way that you can look at or should kind of consider as you're traveling through that journey to take into consideration. And we've mapped out through the different authors and through the folks at Results for America have outlined, and they're part of your packet that you received if you got this, so I'll refer to if you have this information. There are 7 of them that are kind of the data points that we're working on right now to try and get everyone to work on, and they form, I guess, the criteria, if you will, that we're hoping begin that journey, not an end at all, but some of the impact points, some of the data points along the way, some of the best practices. And in fact, we've seen already some good results that have happened just since this book has come out. So,
and Peter, I think I don't know if it was Ron Haskins or who it was in here that talked about specifics like evaluators.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So I mean, let's talk about what some of the things are. So for example, federal agencies should have a chief evaluation officer that can help the staff figure out what the heck does this study mean, because a lot of the staff won't really know how
Or
to
that there
interpret.
even ought to be a study.
Or that there ought to be a
Right,
study.
right.
So that's something, for example, the Department of Labor has done. One of this kind of ranking here in red and green, one of the things that is evaluated is whether that person exists. Second thing is,
And they actually all do now for
the ones that are, yeah,
right,
that
for
are here.
these that are listed here.
The second thing is that you should have a clearinghouse, like the Department of Education has put together, on all the studies that are relevant to what you're doing, so that if a staffer or whomever wanted to get all the evidence on Head Start, you're not going out and doing Google searches. There's a place you can go that has them all collected, easily searchable, ranked by the strength of the evidence and what have you. And frankly, we have put a lot of federal money into many of these evaluations. They should be, not enough, but we should be gathering them together like the Department of Education has done. Another thing, we talked about money being set aside for evaluation. So we propose basically that you should be doing, for any new spending that you're doing, you should set aside a penny on the dollar, 1% of funding, devoted to evaluating the other 99 cents. Simple principle, you're going to start doing something new, let's at least put in place the structure to make sure it works. So, and there's plenty more, but the point is, there's a lot that we could be doing to bolster the Moneyball for government agenda. But ultimately, I should also say, ultimately, where the rubber really hits the road is in the congressional process, and that ultimately is up to all of us as citizens to basically be saying to our members of Congress, this is what we want. We actually want a government that is based on evidence and that is effective and that works, and we don't want to be flying blind like we have been.
And how much traction is this getting on the Hill?
Relative to what? No, I mean.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I mean,
That's
is
the right
anybody
question.
talking about this?
Yeah,
in
so
either
yes,
party?
Paul Ryan and Patty Murray have co-sponsored.
Okay, so Paul Ryan, conservative Republican, Patty Murray, liberal Democrat.
Correct, have co-sponsored legislation that would form yet another commission, but this one I think would be helpful, to basically promote many of these other measures that we were talking about. So there is progress. You mentioned Ron Haskins before. He just came out with a book that documents the momentum that is building in the executive branch for doing much more of this stuff. So yes, all these places that we list there have some form of chief evaluation officer. That wasn't true 10 years ago. And he documents, and the Head Start culling that I mentioned, or the programs in the Department of Education to move towards evidence-based policymaking. There is action, it's just we're starting from such a low base that a dramatic improvement is still insufficient.
And there's a thirst for information and data and evidence that's, that's good and can be actionable in the Congress. I mean, now you can imagine that there's a lot of information. So do you trust it? Is it accurate? Is it good? Is it actionable? All of those are important factors. And is it getting to everybody in a way that's usable? Part of that is a process issue. This is not the first time these issues have come forward. We were talking about this in the back room, that the Truman Commission, the Grace Commission, there's been a lot of bills, there's been reinventing government. That was actually the one that I remember the most that kind of had the most traction. It did for me. It was bipartisan. It was the Clinton administration. It was working with a Republican Congress. There was a lot of
And I should add,
momentum.
run by Elaine Kamark, who was used to have an office up here and taught at the Kennedy School.
And that, to me, gave a lot of the foundation. President Bush came in and did something called the PART program, Program Analysis Rating Tool, which tried to kind of figure out a toolbox to work on this. And the Obama administration took that and ran with it and did a much better job. And now so there's a thirst for it, but left to their own devices, they sit around like the coaches evaluating players, and it's a gut level decision based on politics, because it's usually rapid fire, and it's usually not something where the information is just immediately available. So when it's baked into the process, the way we're asking it to be part of every analysis and every even budget submission, and the analysis of the program to begin with, that will help so that it's informed completely as part of it along the way.
So, as we all know, discretionary spending is not the biggest chunk of spending in the old government spending pie. Let's talk about, well, this is discretionary spending, but still big ticket items. The Defense Department, how are they doing? And then I want to talk about entitlements. How does the Defense Department rank on this?
Well, it's really hard to evaluate the return on most defense spending because you have to be conducting some counterfactual. So where people go instead of evaluating the effectiveness of defense spending, is to a more narrow kind of operations research type of, are we purchasing things as efficiently as we can? And the evidence there suggests that, I mean, the famous, $500 hammers and what have you, that there are plenty of problems in the procurement process. That's related, but I think kind of distinct question from, is the program itself worth it? And there, it's just very hard to do you're not going to do a randomized experiment of half of you get defense protection and half of you don't. Good luck.
Right.
But there are ways there are some incremental ways that could be baked into some things, I suppose, as it begins. But no, heretofore this has not been an area that has had much of that kind of evaluation. In fact, it doesn't even get an official audit.
And then there's that big fat part of the pie, which is entitlements.
Yes.
So entitlement reform, to me, is the most explosive politically to do anything about. I got a personal feel for what the White House pressure is on the Obama White House when I wrote a column about reforming entitlements, and it seemed like a plain vanilla kind of standard, most of us in this room kind of all agree with that, reform entitlements. And I was just spammed with hate mail. You can't touch Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid.
You just can't touch mine. You can touch yours over there, or that one, but not mine. That's the reason.
How does this apply to that?
Well, let's talk about the biggest one, which is Medicare. And actually, there's been just to be clear, there's been several years now of very positive developments in terms of very low growth in Medicare. That having been said, I think the evidence is compelling that we waste a lot of money in Medicare. That maybe as much as 30 to 40% of Medicare spending doesn't improve health outcomes. Now,
Give an example of that.
So the best evidence on that comes from several things. One is the massive variation across different parts of the United States. There's been a running debate about whether, so some parts of the U.S. spend 2 to 3 times as much for each Medicare beneficiary as other parts with no better outcomes. Right. Suggests a lot of potential waste. There's been a big debate about whether that's because the patients in those higher spending areas are sicker than the patients in the lower spending areas. And I think the most compelling evidence against that proposition was recently done by Amy Finkelstein, who is co-director of JPEL North America, which is also doing great work in this area, and I'll come back to that in a second. But what she did with a co-author is say, let's look at people who move. So you move from a low spending region to a high spending region, or you move from a high spending region to a low spending region, and all of a sudden spending on you jumps, either up or down, depending on which direction you're moving. So in order for that to make sense on it just being how sick the patients are, you'd have to believe that someone who is living in a low spending area who suddenly feels like he or she's about to get sick moves to Florida, and vice versa, which I don't find plausible. So massive potential savings. Now, the reason that this is difficult is, coming back to the JPEL North America point, we do not do enough randomized evaluations in how healthcare is actually delivered. That's basically a delivery question. So what Amy and co-authors in a different study found was that something like 80% of the published findings in drugs and devices, so a new drug, based on randomized experiments. Only 20% of the published findings in healthcare services delivery, like should we have this kind of hospital or this kind of insurance or what have you, based on randomized controlled trials. So the quality of the evidence that doctors deploy in order to figure out whether they should be calling someone up twice a month or 4 times a month after they're discharged from the hospital is much lower than the quality of the evidence for this drug versus that drug. And so we don't know as much as we should, but I think overwhelmingly the evidence suggests there is a lot of spending that could be wrung out of Medicare without harming patient
Could you
outcomes.
bake utilization into that too? I suppose you could, right?
That is utilization.
That
So
is.
the point is, utilization
But
of
there's two
healthcare.
sides to it. I mean, the delivery side and access, but also how often you individually, and there are, as I understand it, there are certain regions of the country. It's not just a matter of sickness, is it? It's
No,
also
that's
it's
the
a
point.
matter of, yeah,
It's-
okay.
The doctors, here's the bottom line. Doctors practice medicine in dramatically different ways depending on which part of the country you're in, which hospital you're in, and even within hospitals. So
Yeah.
we're in Boston, or sorry, we're in Cambridge, but at Mass General, for example, they finally did a careful analysis of how doctors were ordering CAT scans and MRIs. And the doctors were amazed to see that they were practicing medicine in just dramatically, and they just didn't know. They just had never really focused on it, and they said, oh, that's interesting. And as a result of that, they also put the doctors' names up on a board in front of the doctors. That helped. You got a significant reduction in the variation in that outpatient imaging rate. The point is, there is, again, and
So
why
why isn't there a bipartisan embrace to do this? I'm going to open this up to questions, so you can start lining up
here's
the
why,
microphones if you're ready.
If you want to get frustrated with Washington, here's the deal on this. I think most people believe that in order to get at that problem, we have to make sure that just doing more is not what you get paid for, because then there's no incentive not to do more. So you need to pay for value rather than pay for fee for service, pay for quantity. We've been paying for quantity. The big divide in Washington is everyone agrees that that's what we should be doing. The Republicans want to have a fixed payment per person that goes to an insurance company through Medicare in a premium supported Medicare Advantage. The Democrats want it to go directly to the hospital through an accountable care organization. That's the divide. And the irony is that as the world is evolving in this direction anyway, the dividing line between the hospital and the insurance company is getting blurred anyway.
yeah.
And hospitals are becoming insurance companies, and insurance companies are trying to acquire providers. So for that to be the sticking point, which it really is ideologically, I find kind of interesting.
That is fascinating. Okay, on questions, you guys know the rules. It has to be short, it has to end with a question mark, and please identify yourself. Sure. Go ahead.
Sure. Good evening. My name is Matthew Kennedy, and I'm a National Security Fellow here at the Kennedy School, as well as a U.S. Army officer. I'm also a Boston Red Sox fan. So my question has to do with the national deficit and the enormous national debt that we have right now, which is generally on par with the gross national product. In the context of the medical examples that we've heard, I understand the diagnosis leads the prescription. The diagnosis is we spent more than we brought in. What would be your first 2 steps in the prescription to solve the problem of our national deficit?
I could start. Well, first, you do have to realize things have gotten better. The deficit is under 3% of GDP. The trajectory is much more stable than it was a few years ago. And that's in no small part because of what I mentioned earlier, which is the rate of growth in Medicare spending has fallen dramatically. Last fiscal year, Medicare spending was up 2.8% nominal, which means you take out inflation, you take out beneficiary growth, real per person spending in Medicare fell. What we need to be doing is doubling down on that. We can do Social Security reform, we can do this, we can do that. There is no single thing that is going to change the fiscal trajectory of the United States more than if we can succeed in wringing more of that waste out of healthcare. And to do that, I think we need 3 things. One is we need to move away from paying for quantity towards paying for value. We need to further digitize the system because that enables lots of additional changes. And we need to introduce, and we are doing this, but we need to do more of it, introduce more transparency and more consumer awareness of what things cost and what the consequences are. An example which is politically explosive is the fact of the matter is that there are places that require advanced directives. So Gunderson Lutheran Hospital, for example, hospital system in the Midwest. If you're admitted to the hospital, you have to tell them what you want to have happen to you if things go south quickly. That is the ultimate consumer-driven healthcare. And it turns out that without being pushed.
Are
Maybe
you a death panel? Is that what you're talking about?
I'm talking about allowing people to decide whether they want to stay in the hospital or go home. And the fact of the matter is about a third of people voluntarily choose that they don't want all this stuff happening to them at the end of life. They want to be able to go home and be
remind us how much of healthcare is spent on that last year
so
of life. Isn't it
about a
60?
quarter of Medicare spending is in the last 6 months of life. The problem is beforehand you don't know whether it's the last 6 months or not. So that's the difficulty there. But in any case, what I would be doing is focusing as much energy as possible on building on this positive trend, which we are at some risk of having evaporate because we don't double down on it. We need to be very forceful in all three of those things, and there's nothing else we could do that even comes close, in my opinion.
Question up there, sir?
Yes, Bill Carlson, previously a technology executive, currently retired. Metaphors are wonderful things, but they can be fairly misleading. I love data, I love analysis, but I would argue that government doesn't have a simple win-loss objective function like baseball does. And furthermore, I would argue that most of what government does is to change the rules.
Okay.
Do you disagree, and if so, why?
Thank you. Jim?
I don't know. I think we had a losing year last year in the government, so I think you can put it on a win-loss record. Going to the question before and adding them together, I think part of it is this breakdown of legislating, of operating the mechanisms of government. I mean, right now, you know, you're no longer a legislator. You're an activist. That's what you go to Congress to be. We have people running for president that have never passed a bill, and that's what they're claiming on their resume is their. And I'm speaking mostly of the Republicans. You know, so actually, I'm speaking only of the Republicans when it comes right down to it. I think Secretary Clinton actually passed a bill. So no, that's part of it. Most of the people on the budget committee today have never passed a budget, or if they've passed a budget, they've only passed it out of their committee. They haven't passed it through the House through the Congress and gotten the president to. So I mean, all of this is just part of the muscle memory of doing something deliberate, as opposed to, as Peter said, yes, we've had some good years from just from a numbers standpoint, but it wasn't because it was necessarily deliberate. It was more because of a default and some mechanisms that happened automatically, not because of good planning and necessarily good leadership. So,
Okay, great. I'm just going to move because we have so many questions. Sorry, Peter.
That's
Go
all
ahead.
right.
Hi, my name is Maya Giacomowitz. I'm the policy director with the City of Philadelphia, and I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about how this conversation then translates to the state and local level in particular, because I think that's where a lot of the service provision ends up happening. And unfortunately, unlike the federal government, we're not able to print money when we feel constrained. So I feel like the onus is on us to really perform above and beyond in the work of evaluation.
Are state and localities better at this than the federal government?
There's a
Evaluating?
lot more activity going on in this area at the state and local level. Everything from social impact bonds to Centers for Economic Opportunity, which is a New York City thing that evaluates programs. I'll put in a little advertisement for my employer, which the foundation at Citigroup is working with some of the folks here on spreading some of those best practices. So it's more exciting, frankly, at the state and local level because stuff is happening than it is at the federal level. And I just say, again, there's a lot that you can do from much of learning from other cities. The Bloomberg folks are promoting. I mean, there's a lot of kind of energy in this space, in part because you're on the ground and you know it matters and you've got to deliver results.
we just announced today that the mayor of Boston has become a Moneyball superstar. I think all-star. That's the word.
Awesome.
Superstar too. Why not? Let's make that the moniker. But so yes, we're working with cities and states on this, and Peter's right. Some of the best activity is happening at the localities.
Right over here.
Turner, senior faculty here at the Kennedy School, and among other things, I teach evidence-based decision-making. So I wonder if you could comment on what you think is necessary in terms of building up the human capital from an education perspective till we have a government that is really knowledgeable in how to evaluate evidence, what the differences are between a correlational design and a randomized field experiment in terms of the conclusions you can draw from it. Because we find when we're teaching everyone from undergraduates on up to senior executives in government and military that there hasn't really been a core piece of training that focuses on understanding methodology and the causal conclusions one can draw from different methods, very little on statistical training. And so what do you think we need to do here at the Kennedy School to help provide the educational basis for a Moneyball government?
Great question. Go ahead.
Peter's chomping at the bit.
'Cause here I feel I'm very energized about this. I think it has to start well before students get to the Kennedy School. And the way that we teach elementary school students, it needs to be dramatically revamped. I really don't care if my kids know trigonometry. I want them to know probability and statistics because the skills that they're going to need later in life, it's very unlikely that they're going to become engineers. Well, maybe, but whatever walk of life they're going into, they're going to need probability and statistics. We have not, in general, revamped the elementary school curriculum for the 21st century, and we need to do that urgently, or else all the kids that are showing up later at the Kennedy School have missed 10 years of training that would have made your job a lot easier. That's not a full answer, because then the question becomes, what do you, and I don't know what to say other than to advertise that there should be more students who are required to take your class. But again, I think we need to start earlier, and then once, I don't know what the requirements are here, but basically no one should graduate from a public policy school with a master's or other advanced degree without a requirement that they take at least beginning probability and statistics and some form of evaluation, because you are not going to be able to function well in any policy position without being able to, you don't have to be able to conduct the research, but you better be able to interpret it yourself.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Up there.
My name is Dorothy Stoneman, and I am an advocate for one of those job training programs. Happens to be one of the 3 named in the Moneyball for Government book as a good investment.
Oh, good.
Good.
Right, which is
Things are about to get really interesting.
It's the Department of Labor Youth Build program,
Yep.
which you both funded and which under Mr. Orszag doubled in funding.
Show off.
However, the question is this. At the beginning, you talked about 2 problems. One, which is ineffective programs being continued, and the other, damaging programs being continued. My challenge is, how do you take effective programs and make sure that they are, in fact, expanded to full scale to solve the problem which they're designed to solve? And that's very difficult because the government works in incremental ways and it tends to stay stuck, even when something is working. And I want to say a little something else to a second question. So one question is, how do you do that? How do you identify these and take them really to full scale, which I define as reaching the limit of demand or capacity? And the other is the difference between RCT and data outcome, right? It seems to me that the ongoing accountability for achieving outcomes is just as important as your random control trials, especially since the results of the random control trials don't come for 8 years, and by that time there's a lot of change on the ground and you need to be tracking how are they doing on those outcomes.
Yep.
So I would like to know about both
Let me
of
do
those.
it briefly from the congressional side.
Yeah.
This used to be where a lot of those kinds of good ideas would come up through the subcommittee process to the committee and on to the floor and so forth. And as a result, that was an entry point where a good senator or congressman could highlight an idea that was coming from their constituents. Maybe it was a private funded idea that came up or maybe it was public-private, or maybe it started at the states or at the locales. But regardless, that was the germination process, the laboratories coming from those areas. But that process, along with the budget process, is quite broken now, in major part, I think, because of the election process and special interests and fundraising and all of the distractions that have taken away from what we refer to as the regular order of the legislative process. And then the second is making sure that the states and the cities in particular, which are the true incubators for that, can get those ideas to their legislative delegations. And that's another point of connection that again has been disconnected, in part because of partisanship. So if you're a Republican legislator and you have a Democratic governor or your senator or whatever, you're concerned about them running against you or whatever, and so you don't even take good ideas like that through the laboratory process. So I would say that's certainly one area that is broken, where that would have been a great access point just through the political and congressional legislative process.
I think advocates of effective programs should be the most forceful in trying to back up the effort to cut back the ones that don't work, because it frees up, I know it's hard, but it makes the politics a lot easier to say, I am in favor of job training, here's the one that works and these other ones don't, and to have people in the field and kind of out there doing it, supporting that, frees up the money to expand. You're not going to get to scale while you're carrying this load of ineffective programs on your back. It's not going to happen because there's just not enough room in a declining non-defense discretionary spending environment. What has to happen is that we cull the stuff that doesn't work to make room for growth. And then on the RCT question, one of the great ironies is we are living in a world in which it's increasingly easy to collect data, analyze it, and have it available in real time. And so in the book, we talk about different kind of degrees of evidence, and I am fully of the view that not everything should be RCTs, and we have to have a spectrum of evidence, and we should be much more aggressive in trying to take advantage of the reduced data acquisition costs and processing costs to have a much more rapid feedback loop on what's working and what's not.
Thank you very much.
Mary Ann Bates, Deputy Director of JPAL. My question is of JPAL North America. My question is, there are many people within academia and at research firms that spend their careers doing this kind of work and doing these evaluations. What can we do to make sure that those results better reach decision makers in a salient way so that they can act on it?
Wow. I'm not sure that, because this is,
Call
we
these
are,
guys.
yeah, I mean,
That's seriously,
certainly
you guys are
that's
the ones that are supposed to put these
that's that
together.
access point that we're trying to create through all of this. But you're right, and it is terribly frustrating that, as Peter was just saying, we have access to so much information. How do you ensure that it's quality information, and how do you get through the noise? Is a terribly vexing challenge. That this is not the only subject or organization that is trying to crack that nut.
I would like to go, sorry, after, I wanted to have you guys interject. Is there a, it's your organization, is there a way to feed these ideas better? Sorry, Peter.
Hi, my name is David Medina, and I'm with Results for America. We're a 3-year-old nonprofit organization, and our mission is to work with local, state, and government leaders to help drive funds towards evidence-based solutions. So exactly what you're talking about. We've done it in a lot of creative ways. We've built a bipartisan coalition of nonprofit leaders, current and former executive branch leaders. We've done Twitter town halls. We've done animated videos to try to build support among the general public. We published this Moneyball for Government book with our 2 great editors. I would recommend for all of you, before you leave, if you can pick up a copy of the index that's been referred to. It's our scorecard of how federal departments and agencies are doing. Secondly, I also want to highlight that we also released today our 2016 policy playbook, which is an agenda for the next president and how they can build an administration focused on data, evidence, and evaluation. So resultsforamerica.org.
Peter?
I was just going to say, I actually would say to the researchers, spend your time doing the research and lean on groups like this, and then the rise of analytical journalism. So there are now increasingly, from the Upshot at the New York Times to the Ezra Klein's Vox.com, there are lots of places that are eager for rigorous analytics that they want to then adopt and broadcast to the world. So feed that a bit, but I don't think it's a good use of a first-class kind of researcher's time to be doing the lead work of trying to convince members of Congress. Lean on the other people who do that for
In other words,
full-time.
I would say find a megaphone.
Exactly.
The press,
Partners,
these guys in
Exactly.
the, the Ezra Kleins of the media world, you guys, that sort of thing, versus going one by one to members of
But
Congress.
even we sit around and frustrate about, how can we get our voice, which is part of the reason why we're trying to access that through the political process. If we can make this something that's interesting to the next administration, next president, that's huge. That's huge. And it's clear that both with Bush and Obama, and with President Clinton, that was a priority. And you could tell by the way they all took that forward.
Great. Next question.
Hello, my name is Lisa Goldman. I'm a management consultant. And my question actually falls very nicely from the question that was just asked. You're talking about putting research into practice and the best ways to do that. And I'm wondering, do you think it would be possible, given that the federal government funds or partially funds so much research that happens in this country, what do you think of the idea of requiring all recipients of federal funds to report their findings back to some kind of centralized clearinghouse, like what you talked about the Department of Education doing? That would then be a central location for not just federal employees, but people in Congress, citizens. We need citizens to be better educated, so our politicians will be more forced to tell us the truth. What do you think about the idea of collecting the information? And you could even say, here's how this study was performed, here's who evaluated it, here you could have a meter about how truthful you think it is or whatever. What do you think of that as a concept?
Isn't this sort of what the GAO and the CBO are already supposed to be doing? Are we talking
GAO more than
the
CBO.
GAO?
Yeah,
would
but
say.
I don't think the problem is that federally financed research is not in the public domain or accessible. It's just all over the place. And if you just required people to dump it into a clearinghouse somewhere, this is why I come back to, I think it's the responsibility of the sponsoring agency and or the oversight agency in that the Department of Labor, Department of Education, to take that publicly available information, which is out there, it's just hard to find, and curate and collect it into the type of clearinghouse that exists. I mean, the Department of Education has shown you can do this and you can do it pretty well. Their clearinghouse, I think, is actually top notch. So we agree on the goal, which is basically all federally financed research, and I would go beyond that. All publicly available research should be in a database that is easily searchable with the relevant domain and the rigor of the evidence and what have you. The only question is, I guess, is it the researcher who's putting it in there, or is there some other way to do it? But we agree on the goal, I think.
Up here, question? Can you talk closer to the mic?
Christopher Scranton with the Mass Big Data Initiative. We've talked actually, Billy, on the last question about this future, and someone say the future is now, of being awash in all of this data that's supposedly helpful. There is a data overload question that is sort of obvious thing to challenge to address. Do you have a perspective on the role of analytics, advanced analytics, machine learning, any kinds of the cutting edge ways we use to sift this data to get insights and outcomes? Have you thought about a layer above the layer of data?
So I think coming back to the earlier question about using non-randomized control trials and outcome data, we can be doing a lot better. And there's a lot more energy in this. So for example, I'm on the board of a set of schools in New York called New Visions, and they have built a first-class data warehouse where it is using big data analytics to basically say, if this kid winds up doing poorly on this test, what does that then imply for the rest of the year, and do we need to be intervening more aggressively? So and that's just one example, but there is lots that we can be doing. This also raises another point, which I think deserves increased attention, which is there are lots and lots of quasi-comprehensive private data sources that are publicly available that need to be combined with the traditional government surveys and government administrative data in order to get better real-time analyses. As an example, in healthcare, which we were talking about before, the official data are so lagged and so untimely that you can do a lot better by gathering private sector data together to get a real-time source of information. That nexus of how we combine official data with unofficial data and the biases that might be created from unofficial data and what have you, that is very important if we're going to take advantage of the explosion in big data, and we're not very far along in tackling that question.
But that is something the Defense Department is better at and is ahead. But it sounds like we should ask you your opinion on that. Maybe we'll get to that afterwards.
Question over here.
My name is Dan Florio. I'm a mid-career student at the Kennedy School. And I'm very interested in this topic. My one concern is how this approach could have problems with outliers. Because we're talking about here, government services. It's different than baseball in that sense. If there's someone who, if there's a program or practice that works poorly overall, it could have a dramatically positive effect on particular subgroups of people. And I guess if you can just address that.
So this is one of the complications in any government program, which is they're often, even when the evaluations are done, they're done on average, not pulling out subparts of the population. As the data revolution continues, it might become easier to do that. That's only a partial solution. But there are going to be situations in which the average effect is 0 or negative, and some people benefit. And then we as a society have to ask the question, if you look at the dollars spent per effective person, then it's going to be astronomically high.
What's an example of that?
There may be some people that do benefit from the ineffective job training programs. Or healthcare provides another example. I talked about all this waste from the variation. Well, there are going to be 1 out of 50 people who will benefit from that much more intense approach in Florida than in Minnesota. And if you cut back on the Florida approaches, for 49 people there's no harm, but for one person or there are going to be people who are hurt. And I think then you have to come back to this question of, we are living in a world of limited resources, and you inevitably are going to wind up, if you're spending money on 49 people ineffectively and one person who's being helped, you're inevitably going to wind up not doing as much even for that one person as if you could better target. And I know it's not a full answer because there is no full answer. This is one of the inherent, I would say, when you evaluate what kind of evidence you use and what level of aggregation you use to do the analysis, those are all very difficult questions, which is why this is not an easy thing to do.
But it also assumes that one outlier that would be harmed by the elimination of that program couldn't be helped by any of the other 16 programs. That probably isn't correct either. So that there would be a transition, or a transition issue certainly to all of that. But, and it is something we should concern ourselves with. But we're not talking about, as Peter said to start with, this is not an on and off switch. It's not all about data or all about emotion. It's just more about data, less about emotion. And I think if you combine it, you're still going to have human judgment in all of this. In the decision to fund a program, the decision to launch a program, to continue a program, or to eliminate a program. There's going to be politics involved in all of that. So data just hopefully gives everybody, particularly the policymakers and us as constituents, the better information about the judgments that we need to make in a constrained resource world with a very diverse population and challenges and needs.
We're out of time, but if you make your question, you're asking a question?
I have a very crisp question,
If you make it real quick, we'll get it in.
Okay.
Go ahead.
It's good news, certainly, that the deficit is coming down. I think everybody's happy about that. Some are starting to talk now about balanced budget, which doesn't make any sense to me. Why is no one talking about budget surpluses, where we have more revenue than money that we're paying out at the federal level?
I'll start by just saying, to me, I've always been perplexed by the balanced budget because it's a data point along the way that you are balanced or not balanced. It's still an equation, and it's a math problem. You know, it does not discuss or determine whether or not you have the right level of spending in any particular program, whether you have the right priorities, you know, whether you're growing as an economy, whether you're serving people who have needs. And so a balanced budget is, and I can tell you this from the last time we got to a surplus, I was part of the team that got us there, and it didn't feel any better the day after than it did the day before. And in fact, it caused a complete change in the attitude of politicians. They said, great, let's start spending money, you know, and which was not necessarily the right thing to, you could argue. So it's, to me, I've always been perplexed by, so am I for a balanced budget? This is, again, the emotion. Of course I'm for a balanced budget. That's what you say on the stump. Truthfully, it's a data point along the way, and it doesn't necessarily suggest we have the right government or a good government or a successful government or a winning season, as somebody asked earlier in the Moneyball context.
Peter?
Well, I'm going to be a little bit of an outlier here. I think what we should be doing is doubling down on stuff that will make the debt and deficit in 2030 a lot lower. But frankly, when the 10-year Treasury yield is well below 2%, and I'm flying back into Newark or LaGuardia, I don't even know where I'm flying tonight, and the state of those airports, as an example, those two things should not coexist. As Larry Summers has said, I agree with him on that point. So my own perspective is we could, if anything, I would rather see a larger deficit over the next year or two to address infrastructure problems, coupled with a lot more emphasis on deficit reduction in 2030, which really comes back to the healthcare question that we were talking about before.
Peter, I'm glad you brought that up because I've been wanting to get infrastructure in. I mean, that is the one place,
There we go.
except for the far right of your party, that there's tremendous agreement that that's a worthy investment and something that will actually contribute to economic growth. You both have been incredibly thought-provoking, and this has been such a high-level audience, too. It's been really a treat for us and an honor for us to be here. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
And I think sometimes there are some that look at Washington and feel like the constraints on the resources, you know, are not as, you know, we print money, basically.
Right.
So that's the one.
We print taxpayer dollars.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's that one side, and we can borrow unlimited amounts to add to that. I think the second part is that, you know, the more you can introduce information to the gut level decisions, Peter mentioned it from the from the policy manager standpoint. From the political standpoint, I was a congressman for 16 years, and I can tell you that if 1% was done, 0% was accomplished from the political side based on evidence. It was all based on typically special interests, gut level politics, your base, trying to show off for your folks back in your home districts, et cetera, et cetera. Politics is what really drives that, not really evidence and data. So introducing more information, more data, more evidence into this process would inform it in a much more positive way. And interestingly enough, every time I have seen that happen, even to policymakers, even to political folks, it does tend to help them turn a little bit on the direction that policy heads.
So that's a huge nut, and I want to get back to that in a minute, but I want to kind of maybe talk about some of the horror stories. I have my favorite, which is job training programs, which I wrote about during the recession. We were spending $18 billion of federal money on job training programs, which the GAO said weren't working. We're in a recession.
And what are there, like 40, what is
And there
it,
were
47
there's like
of them?
40 of them across, I mean,
Separate
across
ones
9
that are all
agencies.
trying to-
I mean,
yeah,
it's, you know, and some of them you could, you know, you were actually just, they were like babysitting systems for adults. It was just pretty shocking.
Yeah, but you say it that way, but so from a politician standpoint, okay, so let's say I go out and I want to cut one of them.
Yeah.
What are they going to say about me, right?
You're
I
back.
must not care about people who are looking for work. I must not care about retraining. I must not care about the lower income. You know, I don't.
Your program. The forum will begin shortly. Thank you.
Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. I'm Maggie Williams, Director of the Institute of Politics at Harvard University. Tonight's forum focuses on Moneyball for Government, a project which encourages governments to increase their use of evidence and data when investing taxpayer dollars. I'd like to thank tonight's forum co-host, the Taubman Center for State and Local Government, the Harvard Business School Social Enterprise Initiative, the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston, and the Ash Center for Democratic Governance. I would also like to welcome to the forum the Ash Center's project on Municipal Innovation Advisory Group. The advisory group is composed of representatives from some of America's largest cities, and we're so proud to have you with us tonight. Our moderator tonight is Nina Easton. She is the senior editor and columnist for Fortune magazine. She covers politics and economics. Easton is a sought-after commentator and a panelist and has appeared on Fox News Sunday and other political programs. And something she's doing, which I think many of you will be interested in, is the Smart Woman, Smart Power iTunes podcast series. It's original programming, which is sponsored by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's a weekly program, and I hope all of you have an opportunity to hear it. She is an author. Her book, Gang of Five Leaders at the Center of the Conservative Ascendancy, has been described as one of the best narrative accounts of the modern conservative movement. Nina Easton was a 2012 Goldsmith Fellow at the Shorenstein Center, and most importantly, she is a former fellow of the Institute of Politics. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you, Nina.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you for that introduction. So we are thrilled tonight to have two best-selling authors, straight hot off the press, Moneyball for Government. I should also plug right now, you can download the whole copy, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I don't need to introduce the two gentlemen next to me, but I will anyways. Jim Nussle was, of course, a former member of Congress from Iowa, OMB director. Another OMB, and you're with the National Credit Union Association now, correct, running that. Peter Orszag was a high-profile OMB director at CBO, knows his numbers, and is now with Citigroup. Of course, Peter's a Democrat and worked under Obama, and Jim's a Republican. What you're going to hear tonight, aside from a lot of numbers and analysis and so forth, is a lot of bipartisanship. And having just come up from Washington, where I was just telling Maggie I co-wrote a book on the Reagan administration. I'm embarrassed to say that's just about how long I've been there, except for that glorious year here. You know, as you know, the just bitter partisanship continues there. So what's really cool about this book is not only these two gentlemen joined together, but you'll see really huge names from both parties coming together on a really important cause. So you guys, you think that the sort of staid budget process in Washington actually has something to do with the Oakland A's circa 2002. Peter?
Well, yeah. The point of this book is that we can do a lot better in bringing analysis and analytics to bear on how we make decisions. And that was the basic, that's sort of where the analogy ends. But that was the key to success for the Oakland A's. It is stunning. Only 37% of federal managers have had the programs that they oversee, any program I should say, any program they oversee evaluated within the previous 5 years. Just think about that. That means 2/3 of federal managers
care because I've gone in and I've challenged it or I've wanted to cut it. And I think heretofore, because that challenge came without a lot of good basic data behind it, it looked that way. So the more you can also apply information to that and evidence, I think the more it will inform the debate and will help those that want to try and push for changes, push for reform.
Peter, what are some other examples?
Well, actually, the worst examples are where, I mean, you're talking about examples where it just doesn't work. The worst examples are where it's completely counterproductive. So, for example, there's a program called Scared Straight, which some of you may be familiar with, where the thought process is if you expose young people to criminals, they will get scared straight and stay out of trouble.
Who came up with that idea?
I don't know where their origins were, but
it wasn't me.
But the results show that, unfortunately, if anything, people exposed to that type of information seem to adopt criminal behavior more frequently, not less frequently, perhaps because people look at that and say, actually, that seems kind of cool, or what have you. I don't know why, but it's completely counterproductive. So the worst situations are where you're spending money, and it's not even just a waste, it is directly counterproductive. The bulk of the problem, though, is where it's just ineffective. And let me make one other point, because I think Jim's exactly right, that when you're in a world of abundance, you can afford to not really worry too much about whether things are working. Both parties have agreed to caps on both defense and non-defense discretionary spending that I think are going to be extraordinarily hard to abide by over time, with non-defense discretionary spending next year being lower than it's been in the historical record as a share of the economy since 1962. And by 2022, 2023, we're going to be significantly below that. In that environment, you can't just indiscriminately cut things. There's a great example involving a program called Youth Opportunity Grants. Okay, so this was a program that was designed to managers haven't had their programs evaluated at all, or at least they're not aware of it, over the previous 5 years.
It's amazing.
We went through non-defense discretionary spending, which is the part of the budget that's set each year by the Congress outside of the Defense Department. It's outside of Medicare, Medicaid, and the entitlement programs, and tried to identify what share of the spending actually had any evidence backing it whatsoever. And our initial estimate was under 1%. We've updated those numbers, and now I'm going to say about 1%. But that means 99 cents on the dollar of non-defense discretionary spending is just kind of on autopilot. We just do it because we've been doing it, and we've got no clue whether it's working or not.
That's just amazing. And I think it's amazing for folks in this room to hear, because if you're involved with nonprofits, that sector, certainly results evaluation data has become a central part of that. And Jim, Moneyball, talk about why Moneyball and follow up on Peter's remarks.
Well, and Peter's right. I mean, the analogy is an interesting one. The movie that was very popular, I actually watched it recently again because it's a great movie. It's a fun movie.
Are you guys baseball fans, by the way?
I am, yeah.
I grew up in Lexington, and the Boston Red Sox broke my heart so frequently that I know.
But Red Sox and
I know,
Cubs
they're back.
fans, so
They're
I mean,
back.
I'm a Chicago Cubs fan, so we're still waiting. You at least got one. But the analogy, yeah, it could be. The analogy is, it kind of ends with, of course, we're not in a dictatorship. You don't have one manager that runs everything, and you don't have one owner that can basically make all the decisions. And so you can't control all the levers. But the point that Peter was just making is that even if you did a little bit more than 1%, you'd be on a better road. But I do think there are a couple of things that came out of the movie that also bear repeating here too, that are kind of just principle level ideas, and that is that if money is not a constraint, you, generally speaking, don't have to be very creative, right? I mean, the more money you have, the more that money is not an object, the more you don't have to think about creative ways, you just keep doing it.